guy who gets killed off by Ali, which is the first accused. Peter accuses him, says that he's gorgeous, I love him. But, do you know the films of the Pakistani director Jamal?
No.
Oh God, you have to see it. You have to see it.
Where would you find it?
Oh, by the one DVD. There was a scene at the beer bank where it's very, very good. He made by Gina. But Gina is played by Christopher Lee. Stuff like that. But he made, I mentioned anyone in any conception which stars in Adidas and
Hi. Yes, I'm your chair, so I know to introduce. I'll just do it by just kind of your name and the title rather than I'll also sit. I won't sort of sit next to you, but I'll come down and introduce you and then come back to the questions. We'll do the questions at the end. Yeah, the first is Mykyta, so yeah. But your cowboy's already loaded, so we're all ready to go. Fantastic.
Saleable English language books. So she's a white American who's engaged in cultural appropriation. And her husband is James Wilson, who is a British environmentalist. Alice who's trying to stop people there's not a shoot, trying to stop people for hours
Okay, I think we are on, and
so yes, we just don't have a speaker. So.
Oh right, we have to wait for the speaker then. Okay, right.
What do we do? He's here. Hello, he's here. Yes.
And she makes Rory go to a eunuch shrine, and there's all this dance and they make him drink some drugs. And then he falls asleep.
Do you have a PowerPoint? No. So if you want to go there, and I'll introduce you, and then I'll go my seat, and then I'll be the next person. So rather than you have.
Dobra, zostawiamy. Patrz, widzisz, chodzi mi o to ramy, zobacz. Wypośrodkowała kamera. No tak, ale ja rozumiem, ale kamera się wypośrodkowała teraz, nie? Dobra, tak zostawiamy. Ja nie będę nic ruszał. Prawdopodobnie jak Mykyta, nie? No.
And he's playing by the forget. Very
and just the timing. So are we?
No, just like we try to squeeze it a little bit, but like if we are late within a like 5 minutes, it's fine.
Okay, so that'll probably come in most of the questions. See how we go. But,
and the thing is, the Hijra's own the baby. The baby has to be brought to the Hijra's, donated to the Hijra's to come back to shrine and stuff. So
okay then, so let's start this pre-lunch session. I have a pretty keen sense of the timing here, given that lunch is coming, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers this afternoon. And from the University of Exeter we have Mykyta Isagulov, who is going to. Did I do that okay? Yes. Very positive response there to my attempt to pronounce your name. And his paper, fascinating title, Panic in Italy, Exploring E.M.F. Forster's Intermediality as a Tool for Exposing Social Prejudice and Stereotypes. So,
thank you. Hello everyone. I don't like the sound of the microphone. Actually, before I start reading my paper or the things that I wanted to say, I just wanted to start to say that yesterday when I was trying to fall asleep, I had a sort of nightmare feelings, because I thought that what would happen if hypothetically Forster didn't use Italy as a setting for his 2 novels, but would actually write about India immediately. And then I thought, would he actually make the same use of media in his text? Would he still use the actresses where he used them in Where Angels Fear to Tread or A Room with a View? Would he still be speaking about panic and the great god Pan? So I will speak about the Italian part, because in intermediality studies, you're sort of not recommended to speak about cross-cultural borders. It's not considered to be intermedial for some reason. So I thought about speaking, I wanted to speak about the Italian part, and I think we can all think about the Passage to India as another novel where the same things could be possibly possible. So basically in my chapter, in my thesis, I have a chapter on Forster, and in this chapter I argue that Where Angels Fear to Tread and The Room with a View are traditionally considered to be the Italian novels, but based on the media, which is medialization of the text, which is done by Forster, Maurice can be surprisingly considered an Italian novel as well, despite the fact that he just mentions it several times, but the Hellenic layer there is very significant, I would say. The key element behind these three texts that I was interested in can be summarized by the quote from one of the Forster's letters. He says, I would bring some middle-class Britishers to picnic in this remote spot. I would expose their vulgarity. I would cause them to be terribly frightened, they knew not why, and I would make it clear by subsequent events that they had encountered and offended the great god Pan. The involvement of the ancient deity with the respective layer of Hellenic mythology makes his works medial. At the same time, they're intermedial because they're heavily supported by visual elements, ekphrases, and often music, sound, and specific Forster's symbolism and prophetic allusions. Overall, I argue that the combination of media and symbols in the literary texts helps build a distinct opposition between North and South, British Isles and Italy, two cultures, two characters, two languages, two mentalities, and two artistic legacies. These and other binaries employed by Forster, oppositions often media-based or backed by non-literary elements and fragments, they help Forster to speak of stereotypes and expose them and laugh at them. And yet Forster's own ambivalence does not allow him to strip himself of the stereotypes entirely. While consciously exploiting the stereotypes and prejudice in the texts, he is also promoting them, strengthening them in what I believe to be an unconscious act. In the end, Forster remains a closeted middle-class white male from England who cannot be entirely true to his readership and who has to restrict himself in his life and his writings. Forster also says that the four characteristics of humanism are curiosity, a free mind, belief in good taste, and belief in the human race. But does he actually manage to be a humanist himself? While there are plenty of things to be criticized in his text, alike to any other 20th century writer, I prefer to be Forster's ally and supporter rather than critic, and I try always to highlight his achievements, like for instance, the masterful use of the literary medium in his works and shortening of the novel's length, which I think is a good thing, and opposing of prophetic functionality in his medial incorporations and integrations, which are often called illusions by the scholars. As Forster's mind and other aspects of his life are often closeted, hidden by him, they get commented upon by scholars and named as outcomes or causes of his ambivalence. David Levitt states that Forster is an ambivalent writer afraid to go deep into the depiction of the social abysses and prejudice. I think it is not entirely true, as medial and non-medial elements employed by the writer in his Italian novels build a strong opposition between Englishness and non-Englishness, with domestic being opposed to alien, imperial to foreign, which is quite typical for the turn of the century's culture and literature. Forster focuses on stereotypes and the cultural abyss differently. Primarily, he speaks of the greenery and countryside as places of freedom, while urban and suburban are places of limitation, incarceration of human freedom. Trying to abandon the traditionalism of the English society of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, Forster sends his key characters who are locked in love triangles abroad to have more freedom, to expose the society that raised them and prejudice, to show them real life. Unfortunately, while Caroline and Philip and Gino from Where Angels Fear to Tread, Lucy, George and Cecil from A Room with a View, Maurice, Clive and Alec from Maurice, all try to abandon England and explore Italy and Hellenism, they all get trapped in the world of stereotypes. They cannot gain freedom, physically, verbally, or in terms of their behavior. Forster tries to elevate Italy to the home of Hellenism and expose the Englishman's lives full of stereotypes and prejudice, and yet he relies on the language of stereotypes himself regarding Gino and other Italians, English fans of Italy, Englishmen who live in Italy. He also relies on places known to the English readership from Baedeker without introducing any new locations. In many cases, Forster repeats his own Italian voyage, which was standard stereotypical and probably dull. He either remains trapped in stereotypes of his own, or is just unable or unwilling to present a new language to his readers, a language that would be devoid of cliches and prejudice towards the South and foreign cultures. For example, in visual terms, he unconsciously builds an opposition between brownish sea-like England and bright, vague, gilded Italy in where angels fear to tread. Here, I'm not sure whether it comes from the legacy imprinted in Forster's culture and mind, or is done consciously by him. What I'm sure is that his stereotypes get intricately linked to the imagery of nature and natural symbolism, and often work twofold, both exploiting the stereotypical behaviors and exposing them. I'm not a native speaker, I don't know, luckily or not. I did not live in the Edwardian era, and unfortunately I don't know whether the depth of such game with the readers actually works. As Forster was a successful and popular writer, most probably it didn't work well. It seems that the English readership did not taste the bitter irony he implanted in his texts while speaking of Italy and lost Hellenism. Otherwise, British society should have been shocked by the Forsterian mocking of the typical behaviors of the Englishman abroad. Forster undoubtedly employs the Hellenic pen along with the Italian cultural heritage of Dante and early Renaissance painters. He cultivates the Hellenic concept of freedom through allusions, opposes it to English rigidness, which is based on the layers of William Shakespeare, Walter Scott, Pre-Raphaelites, and other layers. He indeed opposes antiquity and modernity, rural and suburban, lower and upper middle classes, but his ambivalence gives the readers a choice: to see it or keep it unnoticed, read it like a more profound book with deeper double layers of symbolism, or read it like a pop text, ignoring the hints at or overt discussions of social injustice, decaying England and British Empire, and dated stereotypes and traditions unfit for the times of modernity. His other conscious acts and medial experiments include incorporation of extended ekphrases of paintings and artifacts from non-literary media. As I said, this usually accentuates and sharpens the difference between nations and opposes English to non-English and North to South. Forster claims that, I quote, parody and adaptation have enormous advantages. Yet he employs fewer medial elements than other modernists, makes less use of parodying principle of the novel. Nonetheless, his integration of non-verbal media is consciously and meticulously measured and limited to specific portions, being applied to particular purposes and plot twists. Seen by scholars as specific Forsterian allusions, these medialized elements often have critical functionality. As Frederick Crews states, I quote, seemingly offhand quotations will have a serious thematic relevance. To do so, Forster chooses what is usually said as, he consciously chooses Jane Austen as his literary guide, as both are firmly situated inside bourgeois culture and detached enough to satirize it, as Wendy Moffat also argues. As an outcome, he employs a self-reflexive range and free indirect discourse in his novels to slip in and out of the consciousness of his characters, especially their imperfect lands. Austen-like simplified fables allow Forster, as J.S. Martin argues, to go beyond and reach out to the unseen and the infinite. Going back to the second quote that I used from Forster, is the mind of Forster the humanist free enough? His direct appeal to other cultures, specifically Italy and its arts, can be seen as Forster's fear to directly oppose England and speak of confusion about his sexual role, his feeling of alienation, as Moffat and Francis King state. The connection of the Italian layer through media and artifacts helps Forster reveal the absurdity of traditionalism imposed during the Victorian age, showing the culture-based split through what Ruth Padal calls a painful and tragic exploration. Forster most certainly demonstrates the abyss between nations, speaks through stereotypes, and positions himself as an ironic moralist. Eventually, he presents his characters with the challenge to overcome the artificial barriers of status and reach out to find their true brothers, as most of them tend to seek completeness through other people. Hence, Italy, and I believe India and other locations too, has become a challenge-producing location. Its Hellenic legacy helps Forster refer to Pan as an embodiment of nature and chaos, freedom and primitive Dionysian arts. Referral to Hellenism allows the writer to speak of, as Crews argues, a reasonable and civilized acceptance of man's full nature, a circumventing of the modern extremes of inhuman machine worship and morbid salvationism. Sending the characters to Italy to meet Pan and have a taste of freedom relies on the romantic tradition of embracing Italy as the home of brilliance and passion, opposing the English fog of snobbery and moralism presented through the Cambridge ideal. Forster says that he couldn't write down nature, and therefore he decides to write down man, focusing on his characters and their minds and souls. Nonetheless, he continues referring to cultural naturalistic landscapes around them, the landscapes that are meant to fight stereotypes, social restrictions, and encourage social patterns. Opposing the lost Hellenic paradise of the South to modernity and conventions of Edwardian England, he eventually manages to discourage religion and Christian beliefs and encourage the freedom of choice. As a result, in his text, according to Padel, the Edwardian upper middle class, bearing provincial conventions, double standards, hypocrisies, and the merely prejudices, gets broken by Italian lower middle class conventions, values, landscapes, open sensuality, and art. Both classes are stereotypical in their presentation, but the Italian stereotypes eventually win. Eventually, the choice of pen as the guide promotes nature, anxiety, primeval freedom, and panicos, making Forster's oeuvre guided by Hellenic mythology. Consequently, in his Italian novels, the characters of Forster balance between the socially assigned roles and internal instinct-driven desires, Apollonian and Dionysian, forming what John Colmer calls domestic comedies or Elizabethan tragedies. As Forster states, the displacement, I quote, reveals who you actually are. In addition to the geographic disposition in Europe that has to help fight the stereotypes and conventions or maybe entertain his readers, Forster also contrasts ascending and descending in his text, katabasis and anabasis, going down to hell and up from hell. This echoes or sometimes directly refers to Dante's Divine Comedy, building what Rose Macaulay refers to as an odd but happy juxtaposition of the two writers and their philosophies, which significantly enlarges the contextual field of the novels. To finish, I would like to say that when I was writing my master dissertation on Forster and Somerset Maugham in Ukraine in 2011, I was told that Maugham was so loved in the Soviet Union that he got too many scholarly papers written about him and his texts. At the same time, Forster was indicated as someone unknown and unappealing to the Soviet readership. At the same time, I was told that the Western academia is different. Forster is loved and over-researched, while Maugham is ostracized as a pop writer and largely ignored by the scholars. While drafting the chapter of my PhD thesis on Forster, I was honestly, humbly expecting to drown in at least another 10,000 papers on Forster, like I had in case of James Joyce. Yet I was really surprised and disappointed. While so many things have been said about Forster, so many papers have been produced, it felt and still feels not enough. For instance, almost every researcher mentions his actresses of paintings and where angels fear to tread. Yet none seems to speak of their nature, why they're actually used, and why they're used the way he uses them. How exactly they expand his novels, and do they expand them, and how liberal or conservative they make him and his texts for the old readers and modern readers. There are still many gaps in Forster studies, but luckily I believe his texts remain readable, both for the regular readers nowadays and the scholars. Many things can be evaluated, assessed, re-evaluated, and reassessed, given the new context, novel approaches, and methodologies. I genuinely believe that Forster is not as simple as some people say or want him to be. When he chooses to be complex and difficult, he makes it very layered, full of binaries enhanced by fragmentation. His ambivalent approach to many elements, including stereotypes, is neither good nor bad. In fact, it gives us the opportunities and presents many more things to say about Forster and his texts. And I think he truly deserves scholarly attention and new arguments. And actually, I hope that one day there will be a specialized journal on Forster. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Does that mean you're volunteering to edit it? I sign you up, sir.
I'm not yet eligible. I'm not a doctor yet.
Oh, you will be soon enough. Keep talking like that, you will be soon enough.
It's not a university when they might host it, because there are open access journals of this type, certainly in my field.
Hear, hear.
But you need...
And we have you on YouTube volunteering.
Yes. You have the evidence. Right, okay. So probably the wrong seat. Probably want to be here, Nikolai. Yes, but make sure you need a microphone. Yes, so our second speaker in this session today, this sort of pre-launch session, is Nikolai Endres, who's from the University of Western Kentucky in the United States, and he's. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I do.
Yes, in order to maybe pull that up between the speakers, recognise your own a miniature of your front page, you've done it. And his talk today is entitled Expurgating Marshall, the Romosexuality of Forster's Maurice. So Nikolai.
Thank you, Howard. And
just let me start this.
thank you. And actually, in the last minute, I changed the title a little bit to make this relevant. All right, but I'm still going to talk about what's in my abstract. So when he's at Cambridge, Maurice is asked by Clive whether he has read Plato's Symposium. And Plato is an important reference point, there's no doubt about that in Maurice. I've investigated it. And I'll just mention one example. We find the idea of spiritual begetting in the novel. If Maurice made love, it was Clive who preserved it and caused its rivers to water the garden. There's another beautiful passage where he says something of exquisite beauty arose in the mind of each at last, something unforgettable and eternal that built of the humblest scraps of speech and from the simplest emotions. But Plato's more complex in Maurice. Most of the speeches in the Symposium, and it's this dinner party where all the speakers praise Eros, the god of love, they kind of operate in a pederastic context. So this is like an older man, younger man, pretty well-known model that we find in ancient Greece. And it's hard to see how that would apply to Maurice and Clive. They are roughly the same age. It's unclear who would be Erastus, who would be Eromenos, lover or beloved. Clive is third year, Maurice second, but when they meet, Clive actually looks to Maurice more like a freshman, while Clive feels like a graduate student. And then second, many Forster scholars classify the relationship between Maurice and Clive as Platonic, and then point to Plato's waning sway with the introduction of Alec, the gamekeeper. But I would actually say that it's kind of just the other way around. I think because Clive has such a limited understanding of Plato, as he says, but surely the sole excuse for any relationship between men is that it remained purely Platonic. And in fact, early on, Maurice kind of dismisses Plato and says the story of his Harmodius and Arsagiton, they were like a famous couple. They killed like a tyrant or tried. Phaedrus of the Theban band were well enough for those whose hearts were empty, but no substitute for life. So this is when he's with Clive, right? But then toward the end, once he's in a relationship with, or has met Alec, right, he says, it strikes me there may have been more about the Greeks, Theban band, and the rest of it. So actually, I think he kind of comes to appreciate Plato a little more because of Alec, right? But in any case, I actually want to pursue another erotic model, and it entails a departure from Greek or Platonic love. And Greek, Greece, it actually gets a lot of bad rap in Maurice. It begins with Maurice's warmongering speech in vile Greek at his school Sunnington, and for which he receives George Grote's History of Greece. Then there is the infamous translation scene where the dean says, amid the unspeakable references, unspeakable vice of the Greeks, right? And then there is Clive's, symposium disaster, right? And this is a famous scene. I don't know if you're at the symposium. Clive said, and Maurice felt uneasy, right? And goes on, and Maurice was scandalized, horrified, shocked, right? But his friend was gone without a word, flying across the court. The bang of his door heard through the sounds of spring, right? After this, Clive proceeds to write fatuous poetry such as Shade from the Hellenic ships. Mr. Borenius, director at Clive's estate, believes that the atheist is nearer the kingdom of heaven than the Hellenist. The insupportable Mr. Ducey, right, when they run into him in the British Museum, is looking at a model of the Acropolis, another reference to Greece, right? And of course the greatest irony is Greece's miraculous ability to turn Clive normal, right? Usually a homoerotic sight, but he meets his future wife there. So why this dislike of Greece? Norman Vance, who has studied the Roman influence on Victorian Britain, and again, Forster was very much born a Victorian, right, in 1879, offers an explanation. I quote, "Though Greek scholarship and the teaching of Greek improved enormously in the course of the 19th century in England, the Greek world tended to be the preserve of expensively and extensively educated males, the products of public schools and the older universities. So an acutely class-conscious writer like Forster, right, I guess would have a good reason to maybe go beyond Greece and maybe look at a more democratic model, namely Rome." So in her essay collection, Ancient Rome and the Construction of Modern Homosexual Identities, and I have an essay in that, and it's popularly termed Romosexuality. Jennifer Engelhardt, she wanted to title that essay collection Romosexuality, but they wouldn't let her. So she begins her introduction with the translation scene from Maurice that I quoted earlier, right? But adds that another crucial allusion to a classical text has been overlooked, and Maurice's unexpurgated Martial, which Maurice stumbled across in his grandfather's library. Martial is then mentioned again, or rather not mentioned, in Clive's coming out scene. "You've read the Symposium," Clive asked. Maurice had not, and did not add that he had explored Martial. So why Martial, why Rome? I think even again a cursory reading of Maurice reveals a lot of references to Rome and I guess by extension Italy. Maurice and Clive spend a pleasant vacation in Italy and make a point of not going to Greece. After speaking out the unspeakable to his family physician, Dr. Barry, who owns a Venus de Medici in bronze, Maurice feels like having appealed to Caesar. And the hypnotist recommends that Maurice go to Italy or France, which has adopted the liberal code Napoleon, right? And then Maurice and Alec meet in the corridor of the Roman emperors in the British Museum, another reference, right? And then in the terminal note, Forster contrasts Clive and Maurice's chaste affair with southern lassitude, as he says. What Italian boy would have put up with it, right? So again, why Rome? To quote Engelhardt again, Rome allows for a multiplicity of different approaches. Therefore, Roman homosexuality and discourses of sex are open to a wider range of differing appropriations than Greek models are. Greece offers a more restrictive paradigm of pederastic pedagogy. So when we look at the Roman influence on Maurice, it kind of emphasizes four key ideas that I want to talk about and I think that are like central to Maurice. One is erotic reciprocity that includes sex, long-lasting happiness, the individual against society, and class transcendence. So I want to begin by laying a bit of groundwork, and P.J.M. Scott, he may be a little harsh, but he may have a point. You know, Forster is hopeless at treating love in its form of agape or eros or sexual or religious affinity. His great cards are kindness, charity, brotherly mutuality between people who do not expect to go to bed together. You know, which accounts, after all, for at least 99% of our human dealings. So Forster and friendship, I think that's an interesting combination, and you're probably familiar with the most famous statement about that, right? If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country, not my friend. So early on, Maurice actually has a dream, right? And it's kind of like a long quote. He scarcely saw a face, scarcely heard a voice say, "This is your friend," right? And again, this word comes up repeatedly. He would die for such a friend. He would allow such a friend to die for him, right? And then after he meets Alec, right, in the second quote, right? Again, he returns to this idea, right, of like a friend, right? So friendship crucially implies a fundamental reciprocity, an extension of self to other, a whole that is greater than its parts, and it's a way of bonding that we associate with Rome rather than Greece. In the words of Craig Williams, who has written kind of like the standard work on Roman homosexuality, but also friendship, there's long been an awareness that Mykyta played a fundamental role in Roman culture, pervading social relations and shaping ethical ideals seemingly more than did philia, the Greek word for friendship, in the Greek world. Of course, there are Greek texts on friendship, probably Plato's Lysis, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but they do not come close to probably the most famous text on friendship, namely by Cicero de Amicitia, and who quotes, "Friendship is nothing other than agreement in all matters, divine and human, joined with goodwill and affection. Besides wisdom, I think the immortal gods have given humanity nothing better." I think this sounds very much like what Maurice has been dreaming about, this idea he could die for such a friend, he would allow such a friend to die for him, they would make any sacrifice. And for kind of like a homoerotic example of this kind of friendship, I want to turn to Virgil, and then I'll get to Marshall. Now, Forster knew Virgil intimately because his friend Goldie Dickinson had commissioned him to edit the Aeneid for Dent, and it was translated and came out in 1906, right? I mean, we've heard that anyone who edits a text is intimately familiar with it. And Forster would have come across a homoerotic couple, Nisus and Euryalus. They're like a pair of Trojan warriors. And that's how they're introduced. First Nisus and Euryalus, none so fair as young Euryalus, in youthful bloom and beauty, none with Nisus could compare, in pure affection for a youth so rare. And like I said, they're Trojan warriors. They love each other, fight for each other, and die for each other. Yet not in vain, as Virgil says, "O happy pair, if aught my verse ensure, no length of time shall make your memory wane." And the translation I'm quoting is the one that Forster edited. Now, there are few fortunate moments, let alone lovers, in the Aeneid, but Nisus and Euryalus are one exception. So what is their significance? First of all, we have kind of like a real flesh and blood homoerotic couple here, which is something Forster would not necessarily have found in Plato. I mean, there may be a reference to the Theban sacred band, but no couple really stands out in the symposium. Two speakers, of course the four, they're like couples, but we don't really learn anything about them. Second, even though their relationship is clearly pederastic, one is older, one is younger, right? They are devoted to each other, or they are in love with each other, which again was not the rule for paiderastia, right? It was like the older man was in love, and the younger man responded more like with friendship, right? So they're in love with each other. His amor unus erat, are the words used here, right? And again, this idea of two people being in love, reciprocated love, it's very rare in the symposium. I mean, Alcibiades is in love with Socrates, but that's not reciprocated. And then Aristophanes has a myth, but there's some kind of like comical element to that. Third, Craig Williams, again, who has studied Virgil's erotic vocabulary, concludes that a Roman audience would have understood them as sharing a sexual bond, right? So that they clearly, and again, that brings us back, it's unclear how much sex there was in some of the pederastic relationships, right? Fourth, we not only have a happy pair, but a happy ending, right? And of course, that is the very crux of Maurice, as he says, a happy ending was imperative. Fifth, and I think this may have made the biggest impression on Forster, when Euryalus begs Nisus to join him in combat, Nisus initially refused, pointing out how Euryalus' mother would be inconsolable if her son dies. Still, Euryalus fights, for his love for Nisus is greater than his familial bond. In other words, love here trumps family and country. So, I think Virgil has laid the groundwork for Forster. We have two homoerotic lovers whose love is one, reciprocated, who have sex, and who will be remembered forever, and I guess who defy kind of like legal and political expectations, right? All things that are very important to Maurice. But what is Marshall actually doing in Maurice? Now, since Maurice comes across an unexpurgated Marshall, there must have been expurgated Marshalls as well, right? And Marshall has quite a reputation. But what is it that Maurice would have found in Marshall? Actually, not that much, at least in terms of quantity. J.P. Sullivan, who's a great expert on Marshall, counts a total of about 1,200 poems, right, in Marshall's corpus. And I quote, only 86 of which a Victorian amateur of Latin literature would blush to offer in a literal English translation. So 86, well less than 10%, right? Are actually among the kind of like notorious ones, right? And in those 86, Maurice would have read about large penises and gaping vaginas, assholes and diarrhea, cunts and cunnilingus, husbands, hemorrhoids, incest, indigestion, all kinds of things. He would have come across homosexual activity, but mostly as pederasty, as was more typical, or with kept slave boys, which of course is the point of Maurice, right? That Alec is not a kept boy. Regarding sex, Marshall valorizes the phallus, but heaps scorn on anal passivity. Of course, you wonder how can the one exist without the other, right? And again, I won't have time to get into what kind of sex life Maurice and Alec have, but I think it's reciprocated, right? And then this is very typical of pederastic poetry, something else we find in Shakespeare, in the sonnets. Marshall often laments the transience of beauty, right? I mean, that the boy gets older, right? And again, that's the very opposite, to quote Forster again. I was determined that in fiction anyway, two men should fall in love and remain in it forever and ever that fiction allows, right? So it's something that lasts, for forever. So I think Marshall is kind of overrated by Maurice here. He could have conveyed his homosexuality to Clive with Marshall, but of course he never did, right? And did not add that he had explored Marshall. And maybe Marshall is kind of like a stand-in for another Roman writer that would probably make all Victorian amateurs of Latin literature blush. And that is Petronius. Now, Petronius fails to make a direct appearance in Maurice, but I'm intrigued by one of the most incongruous situations in the novel when he's throbbing with passion for Alec. Maurice contemplates reading a history of rationalism, right? Whose author, W.E.H. Lecky, condemned Petronius' Satyricon as one of the most licentious and repulsive works in Roman literature. So, actually I'm going to skip that. So Petronius, you may be more familiar with like the Fellini movies, the Satyricon, but here's what happens in Petronius, and all this is a little complicated by the fact that it's a fragment, but we have kind of like two young men like in their 20s, Encolpius and Iskaldus. They're boyfriends, maybe ex-boyfriends, but it's a little bit back and forth. If anything, it's kind of like mutual relation. If anything, they're kind of like too similar, maybe kind of like Clive and Maurice plus the sex, right? So the third one, Giton, is interesting. Encolpius is in love with him, and for example, imagines like one night here. It's almost kind of like poetry. I think it's something we could maybe imagine, Maurice and Alex saying after they spend the night together. Especially this here in kisses back and forth, right? You see the flow, the reciprocity, right, between the two, and. Again, we have to speculate there a little bit. Encolpius and Iskaldus are Romans in their 20s. Giton is 16 and probably a slave, but not treated that way by Encolpius. And I think that's something Forster would have found interesting if that is indeed the case, right? A slave would have been property, right? Such as Alec would have been a kept boy, right? But he doesn't actually treat him that way. He treats him as an equal, right? Which we see in this kind of like like passage here. So the one more, just and then I'm gonna conclude. As I said, Maurice and Alec meet in the court of the British, in the British Museum, in the court of the Roman Emperor. So that's the other explicit reference to Romosexuality. And I guess it brings up Suetonius, who wrote this gossipy biography of like the 12 Caesars, and lots of sex and of course there's the issue of class, because the emperor's in a class of his own, right? So maybe it's an indication that Maurice and Alec have a lot of sex, or going to have a lot of sex. I don't really know what exactly what the significance of that is, but the sex is not very nice in Suetonius. There's a lot of unpleasant stuff. So, but that's like the other one. So I think that the two explicit references to Romosexuality, Martial and Suetonius, I think they kind of inadequately describe Maurice and Alec, but of course the same goes for Plato, right? At least Clive's version of it, right? That also doesn't really describe, Clive and Maurice well. So they kind of like have to create, something new. And again, this is what Jennifer Inglehart said, right? Rome allows for a multiplicity of different approaches, right? And I think when we look at Virgil and maybe Petronius, I think we find something. We find erotic reciprocity, sex, class transcendence, and happiness. So I'm going to finish with Martial, and I call it unexpurgating Martial. Maurice came across the unexpurgated Martial in his grandfather's library. And why did he own a copy? And how is it possible that Maurice managed to find among 1,200 poems in that unexpurgated Martial the ones that made his ears burn? Maurice is not bookish. He's not known for reading books. He's also a lazy classicist, right? Were there underlying passages, kind of like annotations, things that the grandfather found kind of interesting? Could we say that the grandfather, kind of like Maurice's father, ever engaged in what Forster refers to as grossness, or moved from illicit to licit love? It's pretty obvious that Maurice's father engaged in some kind of like gay relationships too, but then moved on to heterosexuality. So fantastically, if the same is true of Maurice's grandfather, right? Maurice's might offer a genealogy of like 3 generations, right? Of we would call a kind of queerness. And that's really what I see as the role of Martial and all the Romosexual authors in this, in Maurice. Because we have a genealogy of queerness there too. So we begin with Greece, begin with Plato, right? And of course the Roman writers inherited a valuable matrix of same-sex love, right, from the Greeks, but they refined it, complicated it, queered it, right? And now we have Forster as kind of like the 3rd generation, right? He uses Plato, he uses something from like the Romosexual models, right? And had to create something absolutely new, right? But that was kind of like the very point of Maurice. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. So, Maxime, you come down. You'll have to switch on your PowerPoint. Yep. Okay, fantastic, good. So, our next speaker in this session, there we go, working fairly, is Maxime Petit from the affiliations of the first 2 of the Toulouse universities, and his title today, back to short stories, is Dallying with the Past in E.M. Forster's The Talk. So, Maxime.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, I will be talking about the talk, which is not common. So, in his introduction to The Life to Come, Oliver Stalbras takes up P.N. Furbank's distinction between Forster's facetious and serious homosexual stories, and places the torque somewhere between the two subgroups. He notes the strong sense of history and intermittently a grave stylized beauty all of its own, but deplores the ending and the rape fantasy, perhaps the worst bit of writing in the book, demonstrating that it was always the scenes of violent action that gave Forster most trouble. Stalbras notes that sex was also difficult to write for Forster. He approached sex scenes with circumspection, not to say circumlocution, the sort of reticence that Catherine Mansfield famously noted when talking about Leonard Best's Umbrella. The strong sense of history noted by Stalbras is uncommon in Forster's work. The reading of Anatole France's Thais in 1905 prompted a desire to write historical fiction, but The Tomb of Platon and The Torque seem to have been his only attempts. As Hertz suggests, Forster apparently had difficulty writing historical fiction. He notes about The Tomb of Platon that he is engaged on the impossible, a short historical story. Forster was ambiguous about the fate of the talk, writing in 1958 the talk to be torn up, and deciding in 1962 to prepare the talk for non-publication. The story is thus an oddity with a liminal status in Forster's own, somewhere in between the facetiousness and the serious stories, deeply historical and yet somewhat obscene or sub-pornographic, impossible, destined to be torn up but preserved, non-published but posthumously published. An oddity represented by the very word torque, which is derived from the Latin verb torquere, meaning to twist. As Peter Chimes notes, the same verb also gave the English word queer, also a term for homosexual, obviously. In this paper, I want to explore the oddity of this story, which weaves together these three themes which Forster allegedly had trouble writing about: violence, sex, and history. As Philip Gardner suggests, the torque probably originates from a number of books Forster read in 1942, among which the works of St. Augustine, St. Jerome, and Thomas Hodgkin's Italy and Her Invaders, published from 1879 to 1899 in 9 volumes, and Forster draws most of his material from the second volume, apparently. As Forster explains, he was seeking in that period not an explanation of our disaster, that is to say World War II, but wisdom with which to bear them. The situation, however, is queered by the existence of Christianity and the attendant denunciation of sex. The character of Perpetua in the short story was inspired by Saint Perpetua, the sister of Dinocrates, the good thief, who dreamt that she was changed into a man and wrestled with an Egyptian, which Forster read about in Augustine's On the Soul and its Origin. The name Marcian appears in a family tree which Forster copied from another book by Thomas Hodgkin, The Dynasty of Theodosius, published in 1889. And the character of Ureg was based on the king of the Visigoth and son of Theodoric I, also called Theodoric of Toulouse, because they had their capital in Toulouse somehow, about whom Forster read in the same book by Hodgkin. So you've got them there, very respectable Goths. The historical background of the story is the early days of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire and the so-called barbarian invasions. It opens with the ceremony of Perpetua's dedication to God. Devout and tyrannical, she is bound to become Perpetua Virgo, perpetual virginity. And the bishop relates how she and her brother Marcian were attacked by Goths who attempted to rape Perpetua, but she somehow convinced them to stop and repent, giving Perpetua a golden torque to make amends. Marcian starts laughing uncontrollably when the bishop, using the Frank language of the era, the language of St. Augustine and St. Jerome, mentions the fact that the Goths are members like horses. We later learn that the bishop's narrative is fabricated. Marcian actually helped his sister escape and was raped by Eurek, the leader of the three Goths, who gave him the torque as a token of love. Marcian then has a dream in which he meets Eurek in the basilica, and this time Eurek wants to be raped by Marcian. As the torque starts glowing inexplicably, Perpetua goes into the basilica, which is then struck by lightning, reducing Perpetua and the basilica to ashes. The community is liberated from any Christian influence. The short story mirrors Forster's idea in The Consolations of History that history offers the possibility to visit the powerful, but also to revert the power dynamics, allowing one to behave outrageously without being expelled. It also offers the possibility to dally with the past, i.e. to encounter dead courtesans without looking indecent. This indicates that history is perceived as a point of contact with sexuality, a place which makes illegal or unseemly acts possible. This collapse of social and moral norms in history is reflected in the torque. At the end of the story, when the bishop tries to exorcise the community, but finds it equally dispossessed of good and evil. Where human sexuality mirrors natural sexuality, only the animals remained unaffected by the catastrophe. They clucked and copulated as usual. The story ends on a utopian note, similar to that of Little Rimba. Fortunately, it lay out at the root of the barbarian invasions that devastated the rest of the province. It became a charming spot, and Marcian became gay and happy. He never saw Eurek again, but could always send him messages. Any young Goth would accept one, and he gave the name of Eurek to his favourite mare, whose stable he shared on dark nights, and upon whom at a heroic moment he could be seen thundering across the sky, clamped and necklaced in gold. The family farm's location off the beaten track makes it immune to the historical turmoil of the barbarian invasions. It signals a geographic haven as well as a historical one. It renders the farm immune to both the moral influence of Christianity and the turmoil of history. It recalls a number of other Forsterian characters who stray off the beaten track, Harold and Alejandro Ambudocla, who does not follow the well-made path, which is amply sufficient for all rational tourists at the ruins of Akragas. Or Lydia in Where Angels Fear to Tread, who follows Philip's advice that it is only by going off the track that you get to know the country. And she follows that a bit too literally. So the list goes on and on, sorry. But straying off the beaten path signals a transgression of conventional morals, an escape from religion and the law. Perhaps even a form of perversion, as Dollimore notes. Perversion signifies an erring, straying, or deviating from a path, destiny, or objective which is understood as natural or right. And he traces the idea back to Augustine, whose language, as we have seen, is ventriloquized by the bishop in the talk. In this perverted utopia, God is thus substituted with a torque made of gold, a bit like Burton and Turton yesterday, which is only the difference of the letter. The circular shape of the talk reinforces the chronotopic isolation of the utopia. Gold is a mineral like no other, Patrick de Lufer writes, which materiality inevitably conjures up a paradoxical symbolism which negotiates tensions between the tangible and the immaterial, the beautiful and the commercial, the sacred and the profane, the mythical and the political, the ephemeral and the untarnishable, virtue and leper. This ambiguity signals the annihilation of moral values, the distinction between good and evil, in a way that is similar to the nihilism that emanates from the Malabar caves and A Passage to India. Everything exists, nothing has value. Marcian receives the torque from Urek in a scene that is full of echoes. First, the indeterminate echoes of his own name, then the distinct sound of it. Marcian, he shouted, and this time the word rang clear. There was no doubt about it. He vanished into its echoes, leaving nothing behind him but a snake of dust. You notice as well in the first part the twist. The narrator's description of the collapse of values is presented much more ironically than in A Passage to India, and results in the collapse of differentiation in terms of gender or sexuality. A fluidity already present in the actual story of Perpetua in Augustine's narrative. The gods negate sexual difference and are compared to beasts or babies, beings that exist outside of the realm of moral values. The Torque also recalls the statue of the Dallying gladiator, which has been invested with homoerotic significance by other homosexual writers, for example Tennessee Williams in his short story Three Players of a Summer Game, published in 1952, and Forster himself in the main version of Arctic Summer. The eroticism associated with gold and the Torque recalls the other boat, and the reference to Lionel's body. A tongue of sweat spread as he stripped and a muscle thickened up out of gold. The gold imagery is invoked again in Lionel and Coconut's final sexual encounter, during which Lionel strangles Coconut. Blood oozed between the gold-bright hairs, and the scar in his groin reopened. The sweet act of vengeance followed, sweeter than ever for both of them, and as ecstasy hardened into agony, as hands twisted the throat. The image of Lionel's hands twisting Coconut's throat recalls both the image of the torque and the etymology of the word to twist. This final image is also, I think, a distant memory of Oscar Wilde's The Ballad of Reading Gown, itself a reference to The Merchant of Venice, in which gold, of course, is crucial. In the two passages from The Other Boat, gold is highly eroticized, associated with Lionel's penis first, and then with his hands. Two parts of the body, which can be soft or hard, like gold, which is a metal, but also ductile, flaccid or tumescent when tense or aroused. After Urek's first disappearance into echoes, Marcian realizes that the torque fitted him and almost seems part of him. When Marcian touches it, he therefore touches himself and discovers something new, the roughnesses of precious stones, which leads him to associate the gift with one of those stunning feats of horsemanship which are part of the barbarian legend. And you remember that the gods are members like horses. The jewel, thus metaphorically, represents the queering of male genitals and signals an awakening to a type of male sexuality that does not discriminate between men and women. Sorry. The ambivalence and plasticity of gold is similar to those of history, which produces dangerous aberrations. In 1942, Forster copied a passage from Valéry's Regards sur le monde actuel, published in 1931, warning against the dangers of history. Exploring history in search of wisdom with which to bear our disaster, Forster was treading on difficult ground, trying to find wisdom in a history devoid of plot, rhythm, predetermined pattern, or harmony, as Fisher expressed in yet another passage copied by Forster. I can only see one emergency following on another, as wave follows wave, only one great fact with respect to which, since it is unique, There can be no generalizations, only one safe rule for the historian, that he should recognize in the development of human destinies the play of the contingent and the unseen. This is reflected in the narrative structure of the Torque, from Marcion's uncontrollable laughter to the god who came out of the blue and disappeared echoes in dust. The sense of contingency is also explicitly stated by the narrator. The faces of the barbarians were frank, childish, and powerful. Emotions passed over them like clouds. No one, not even themselves, knew what they would do next. What they do next is attempt to rape Perpetua, but here too, the action is marked by confusion, a chaos of limbs and sounds that evoke the way fights are represented in comic books, as you can see from Asterix and the Goth, which I thought was quite fitting. The scene recalls two hypertexts. The first one is the possibly fabricated rape scene in T. Lawrence's The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. So once again, you have the twisted, which I will not dwell on because many of you know well. It's not really super important, and I don't have time. But and the second is the festival of Guwahati, with the same images of legs and confusions, which results in strange thoughts. Indeed, Marcion's thoughts while he is being raped read strangely to us. The surprise exceeded the pain, not me, this can't be for me, was his thought as the notorious Gothic embrace penetrated. Women died from it, the story went. That seed was said to breed devils. Well, scarcely in my case. The idea made him laugh, and he heard Uric laugh, for it had been Uric. Beyond the rape fantasy, Forster was baffled by the idea of rape. When Marcion's parents ask him why he laughed during the sermon, he replies, "I don't know, something I was not thinking of made me laugh." It's unthinkable, if you will. His 1947 reflections on the case of a woman who had been raped by 6 policemen also demonstrate this puzzlement. Once again, this is problematic according to our contemporary standards, but what interests me is the fact that Forster sees rape as something unthinkable, an unthinkable outburst of violence, a manifestation of the abysses in human nature, a disaster similar to the disasters of history. Forster, however, seems to have believed in the opportunity to turn a disaster into a more positive and rewarding experience. Disaster can be delicious, as Forster wrote in 1964 about an erotic story he tore up. Suddenly remembered a short story I tore up a couple years ago like a fool, called Adventure Week, where 8 bored boys have to go into camp and are tricked by the only clever one into a delicious disaster. It was so gay and warm. The use of the word gay recalls Marcion's condition at the end of the Torque. The word gay to mean homosexual was probably introduced in England during World War II by American soldiers, as suggested by the memoirs of Peter Oneblood and Gavin Lambert. The term was included in the OED in 1951. Discussing Forster's relationship with Mohammed El-Ali, Ian Littlewood notes that war, like travel, upsets the comfortable certainties of ordinary life, breaks up routines, erodes inhibitions. It is a means of escaping the bonds that hold you to a particular place in a particular way of life. World War II had a disruptive effect on rigid social norms, bringing together men of different classes, races, and nationality. References to the sense of elation that arose from wartime cruising have become a recurring feature of British literature and film, for example, in The Sparshalt Affair by Alan Hollinghurst. First part is set in wartime Oxford. Das suggests that the practice of cruising in Forster's work is the medium of connection, or marks one's passage to a country, its spaces, people, quirks, and habits. Cruising has been analysed as a specifically queer mode of sociality and of inhabiting space, a way of carving privacy out of public spaces, for Garth Greenwell. Cruising also implies a specific temporality. In the Beginner's Guide to Cruising, a humorous pamphlet published in 1964, George Marshall writes, cruising, unlike Russia's economic development, cannot be planned on a 5-year or even on a 5-week basis. It must be invented and improvised from day to day. Cruising thus shares some similarities with history, insofar as it is a succession of contingent events. As Alan White notes, Forster's late private stories move increasingly toward the celebration of passion for its own sake, the celebration of passing encounters rather than long-lasting connection. In this way, Forster's approach to historical fiction and the Torque could be seen as an instance of cruising history, of carving homosexual desire out of Christian history. The Torque features all the elements associated with cruising: chance encounters between people who would not otherwise meet, the acts of looking, the nighttime atmosphere, the dark corners, sex in strange places, the elation associated with the danger of meeting strange people or the possibility of being found out. But also what Jack Parlett describes as the temporal distance between apprehension and recollection. The stranger enters at the moment of passing into the erotic archive of the observer's mind, more colloquially his spank bank. It then becomes available for erotic creation. This is reminiscent of Forster's insistence on remembering books, feelings, and thoughts during the war, in Functions of Literature in Wartime, which was delivered during World War I. Forster's mention of shame in this passage is interesting, since cruising has long been associated with shame. Remembering, Forster advocates, should not cause shame, but the general sense of greatness, which, whatever we have read, remains and was never more needed than it is today. The sense of greatness, which stems from the remembering of things past, recalls other stories, such as Albert Pompidou. Whether cruising space, history, or literature, the goal is thus similar: carving out greatness out of disasters, not so much thanks to long-lasting connection, but rather thanks to the memories of chance encounters. In this regard, the Torque retains some of the nihilism of Mrs. Moore in A Passage to India, and all this rubbish about love in a church, love in a cave, as if there is the least difference. Rape here is equated with, rape is substituted with love, interestingly, and the location of the church is also interesting with regard to the Torque. The second encounter between Marcion and Urich takes place in the Basilica. This suggests perhaps that the Torque is not just about lust, but perhaps also about love, the text itself an act of love on Forster's part. Among the quotations from Proust's Le Temps Retrouvé, which Forster copied in 1943, there is one which I think summarizes the oddity of the Torque quite well. And so I included the French version because, as you can see, they translated the word aberrations by perversions, which makes sense in that context because it is a passage about Charles's love of what we call today BDSM. And Proust drew heavily on sexological discourse, obviously. Perversions are like loves in which the germ of disease has spread victoriously to every part. Even in the maddest of them, love may still be recognized. Thank you.
Excellent. Come and join us. Thank you so much. Speakers. Do you have a PowerPoint? Or?
No, I'm just going to read it.
Yeah, do you mind then?
I will switch it.
I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will just move this one out of the way. This is just you're able to use your microphone now. just introduce you and then leave to you. So our, oh yes, it needs to be close. It needs to be on. There we are. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're all ready to go on our final talk in this particular session here on day 2. And we have a joint paper given by Professors Arpana and Deetimali Nath from University in Assam, and their paper is entitled Reading Alterity in E.M.F. Forster's Short Fiction. So I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, sir. There's just a small correction that we would like to make. We are not professors. We are just Dr. Deetimali Nath and Dr. Arpana Nath. We are presenting a joint paper, and she has given the responsibility to me to present the paper. So, reading Alterity in E.M.F. Forster's short fiction. E.M.F. Forster's short stories have some interesting points of contact with the novels. Like the novels, Forster's short fiction shares some of the similar thematically related focus found in his novels, such as his preoccupation with interpersonal relationships, social relation, and hierarchies of class and ancestry or lineage. While his fiction has received wide acclamation, and the discussion about his writings and his fictional output continue to invite critical interest, his short stories, with their explicit homoerotic orientation, offers a glimpse of not only a reflection of Forster's own marginal identity as a closeted homosexual, but are also perhaps a testament to his struggle to represent sexuality, emphasizing the importance of other narratives that complicate the cultural narrative about same-sex relations through his intersection with race and class. Forster is uniquely positioned as a writer. He was a member of the literary elite, yet his absorption with the theme of cross-cultural friendship and his representation of the intricate relationship between sexuality and colonialism within the prevailing structure of imperial ideology problematizes the easy optimism of his liberal humanist dictum of only connect. A passage to India indicated the multiplicity of cultural and historical context and the political implications of imperialism that diminishes the notion of cross-cultural relations to an illusion that is highly conscious of the limits rather than the expansiveness of cultural sympathy. Critical estimates of Forster's status as a modernist writer and the flashpoints in his work are widely debated. It is a matter of speculation as to what extent Forster, as a member of the empire's elite, was a participant in the enterprise of colonialism. His prevarication on the subject of empire is evident in the short stories that deal with the theme of interracial sexual unions. These works, published posthumously after his death, areas an indication of a larger crisis in metropolitan culture about what constitutes an English identity or Englishness as opposed to what is perceived as foreign or other, and the central role of sexual politics in the discourse of colonialism. This paper will try to read two of Forster's short stories, The Other Boat and The Life to Come, to examine the representation of homoerotic desire in the discourse of colonialism and consolidation of empire. While these texts seem to indicate an awareness of the divisiveness of colonial rule, a close reading reveals the ambivalence contained within the trope of otherness in colonial settings, where colonizer and colonized interact in close, intimate spaces. Forster's narratives about racialization of ethnic identity reveal the empire's anxieties and assumptions about racial difference that needs to be scrutinized in historically contingent ways. Scholarship on Forster's writings has been interpreted in diverse ways. Some critics have opined that Forster's writings are not sufficiently transgressive to offer challenges to the dominant discourses of his time. Critics like Edward Syle have called into question his anti-imperial impulse to reimagine race relations as elusive. Other studies have drawn attention to Forster's representational ambivalence as a paradox that serves to reinscribe imperial ideology. In The Life to Come, the narrative juxtaposes the assumptions and assertions about racial difference with the imperatives of British hegemonic practices that represent native cultures as the Oriental other. Paul Pinmay, a missionary, is sent to evangelize a group of people in Africa. After a brief and unexpected liaison with the chief of the group, Bithobai, Pinmay is tormented with guilt as he distances himself from the incident. With an intention to set right his lapse, Pinmay works vigorously to spread the new faith among the people and successfully persuades Bithobai and his people to reject their own traditions in favor of the new religion. Bithobai, who is renamed as Barnabas, is enamored with Pinmay and offers his friendship and love to Pinmay that he rejects. The text of the narrative is a dramatization of the consciousness of Pinmay, who is guided by the assumptions of his role and dominant ideology of the time and his pragmatism as he navigates and negotiates his relationship with Bithobai. The narrative tension enacts the ambivalence within the relationship of the colonizer and colonized through the metaphor of temporality. Each section of the text is named after different parts of the day: night, evening, day, and morning. This structure signifies not just the passage of time, but also creates a sense of the effects of the cultural and political domination on the geography, and also its effects on its inhabitants. Pinmay's perception of his immediate surrounding echoes the projections of Orientalist stereotypes of racial difference. I quote from the text, "On the contrary, and it was his hand that beat down the light. And why had he stolen up from the village, if not to tempt? Yes, to tempt, to attack the new religion by corrupting its preacher. He remembered all that he had heard of the antic power of evil in the country, the tales he had so smilingly dismissed as beneath a Christian's notice, the extraordinary uprushes of energy which certain natives were said to possess and occasionally to employ for unholy purposes." This is from the section Night. In Pinmay's imagination of the place, the text plays with the idea of imperialist discourse that cast colonies as sites of homosexual license, as the distant place teeming with unspeakable vice, and Orientals as the civilizational other, lascivious and corrupt, to the white Christian man. Pinmay's aura of shamefulness and self-censorship is because of his inability to accept his own homoerotic desires, and his contact with Bithobai triggers all kinds of fear and self-doubt. Having no understanding of native psychology, and he knew little of the language, his identification of the native culture is filtered through discourse premised on racial difference. The primitive, savage, and irrational native, as opposed to the image of the Englishman, upright, responsible, and able administrator. When Pinmay stumbles from his role, it is as if the entire colonial edifice is at a risk of collapse. His distrust of the other and the fear of reprisal makes him a disillusioned official than a missionary. I quote from the text again, "These people are so unlike ourselves that I much doubt whether they have really accepted Christ. They are pleasant enough when they meet us, yet probably spread all manner of ill-natured gossip when our backs are turned. I cannot wholly trust them. The fear of the other is matched by the aura of self-loathing. The narrative perspective undercuts the self-righteous assertions of English identity. The deployment of irony resists the colonial attitude to suggest the failure of the colonial regime and its discourse of the civilization mission only to hide the vision of a world that is troubled, cruel, violent, and extractive. Forster's use of irony creates a sense of dissonance, revealing the complicity of religion and imperial discourse and the despotic ways of empire. The ironic vision of the text is communicated through lack of harmony between the protagonist's expectations. Vithovai's expectation of a passionate relationship and Pinmay's ambition for the missionary undertaking is an example of racial and cultural gaps separating them. It is a subtle allusion to the differential power hierarchy controlling the interaction between them. Forster was aware about the differing sexual attitudes and behaviors and the associated images of native excesses that incited both fantasies and moral concern within the imperial mind. This is evident from European ethnographic research and its representation of eroticized images of foreign men and the relationship between the European colonizers and native population is a subject of much speculation within literary cultural studies in the 19th century. The expression of homoerotic desire, taboos, and social opprobrium related to it is a recurrent theme in Forster's fiction. Almost all of his novels deal in some degree or the other with the subject of male homosociality. It was not possible for Forster to write openly about desires and experiences he would have liked to explore in his fiction because the law forbade. Being homosexual at a time when homosexuality was not just a crime, but in the precarious aftermath of the Oscar Wilde trials of 1895, an offense that brought with it a disproportionate level of opprobrium. So while prohibitions at home made it difficult for Forster to write about at such a relationship in an English setting, there was no such vacillation in examining inter-ethnic relationship in the context of overseas empires in his short fiction. The imperial experience, together with the accounts of the overseas liaisons of European men with native people away from their own societies, circulated at home and had wide implications for cultural and social life. Forster's use of the metaphor of temporality works on multiple levels and is no less ironic. On one hand, it indicates the nature and its stages of evolution of the relationship. On the other hand, it displays the self-conscious ambivalence of the colonizer joining desire and revulsion in equal measure. There's a quotation from the text. Pinmay watched him furtively and wondered where his old energies had gone. He even felt weaker himself, as if the same curse infected them both, and this though he had again and again confessed his own share of the sin to God and had acquired a natural loathing for it in consequence of his marriage. The text thus subtly critiques the dominant discourse of imperialism with its ideal of white man's burden and shows the inherently racist and violent nature of colonial regime. An extension of the same metaphor implies the crafty and ungodly ways of the missionary activities which acted as another wing of the colonial apparatus to advance the agenda of imperialism. In the chaotic aftermath of the incidents following their first meeting, Vithobai loses everything, including his identity. He is given a new name, Barnabas. Vithobai's annihilation and the effects of violence under colonialism on natives are exposed through coercive measures on the native people. Even though the attraction is evidently mutual, the element of doubt is entirely Pinmay's. Vithobai believes in the new faith. Vithobai's belief in the new faith is slowly replaced by doubt. As the story progresses, he becomes aware of the duplicity and cruelty enforced on him, resulting in violent end to both. The ironic imagination within the text thus shows a skepticism and concern as it examines the more invisible forms of colonial violence carried out through such forms of psychological violence which Fanon describes as natural state in colonial contexts. Forster's portrayal of the relationship as it moves towards its tragic fate locates violence at the heart of this encounter, as it demands a confrontation of sexual and racial identities from its participants. This is certainly not possible within the discourse of imperial ideology. Indeed, it is not desirable for such encounters to be accommodated with the hegemonic urge of colonial conquest. Such a view necessitates recognition of the other's humanity, which cannot be accommodated within the imperial discourse, for that can imperil the very legitimacy of colonial enterprise. Forster's nuanced interpretation of imperial ideology, its denial or suppression of homosexuality, is connected to the English caution about interracial contact and exchange. The prohibitive attitudes against intermingling of races are indicative of the cultural narrative expressing concern about maintaining racial purity. Forster could not align himself with this line of thought. His own views about race can be found in his non-fictional writing that is clearly dismissive of racial prejudice. In his essay, Racial Exercise, he writes, "Community of race is an illusion. Yet, belief in race is a growing psychological force, and we must reckon with it. People like to feel that they are all of a piece, and one of the ways of inducing that feeling is to tell them that they come of pure stock. That explains the ease with which the dictators are putting pseudoscience across. But they have very cleverly hit on a weak spot in the human equipment, the desire to feel 100%, no matter what the percentage is in." His anti-imperial views and his politics can also be found in his critique of Kipling's aesthetic. While Kipling enthusiastically embraced the imperialist ideal, Forster could not reconcile with the divisive politics of imperialism. The Other Boat focuses on same-sex relations that underpins on the material and psychological distance across racial and colonial divide. The story is divided into 5 sections and begins with a journey to England. Lionel and his siblings befriend a native boy on their travel to England, much to the chagrin of their mother, Mrs. March, who finds his presence objectionable. In a foreshadowing of their future encounter years later, Lionel and Maurice form a friendship while the mother reprovingly tells Maurice, "You are a silly, idle, useless, unmanly little boy." Some years later, on a voyage back to India, Lionel and Coconut meet on the ship and resume their friendship. Maurice initiates a homoerotic relationship. The greater part of the story, divided into 5 sections, is devoted to the unfolding of their relationship. Lionel is now a young man, and although he is no longer anywhere near his mother, he cannot free himself from the psychological hold of his mother. As the protagonists enter and inhabit the luminal space of the ship and become participants in a transgressive relationship, Lionel is torn between his private desire on one hand and his outer status as a respectable English officer. Lionel fears that the discovery of his relationship with Maurice can cost him his reputation. The incompatibility between his private passion and his outer public role creates a schism that eventually results in a violent end. While the text allows the reader an opportunity to view the theme of sexual repression linked to the issue of ideological control, it also shows the ambivalence and the shifting course of imperial relations. Like the other short story, The Life to Come, the use of irony and metaphor are the crucial tropes that mounts the critique of sexual repression, as these devices emphasize the social and psychological gaps in which the story's principal characters are engaged. The text dramatizes the social and the psychological struggles of the protagonist as each party tries to articulate the danger and freedom existing within the doubly transgressive relationships, be it as racial or homosexual partners. The voyage across the Suez Canal on the ship is a metaphoric representation of the discursive space that opens up the possibility of a momentary convergence of the East and West, but the pressures of such a disruptive desire represents a threat to the imperial aspirations. Forster's deployment of ironic perspective while being empathetic to the development of interracial connection and its potential for the possibility as route to self-discovery and identity subtly exposes the deep ambivalence and the ideological incompatibility of empires' competing claims of economic and political interests that undermines any room for accommodation within the cultural narrative about race and sexuality. Forster's portrayal of the protagonists in the other boat and their affiliation or non-identification with the larger cultural narrative of race may be read as a critique of the empire's attitude towards subject races and its colony. If Lionel is described as manly Englishman and Nordic warrior, then Maurice is the subaltern other whose indeterminate identity, for he belonged to no race, is his cultural other. If Lionel is the embodiment of English rectitude and manliness, then Maurice's ambiguous identity hints at the discourse about the empire's preoccupation with racial purity. He picked up his education in London and his financial beginnings in Amsterdam. One of the passports was Portuguese and the other Danish, and half the blood must be Asiatic unless a drop was Negro. In both of Forster's stories, the subaltern protagonist defies easy identification with Orientalist stereotypes. If Maurice in the other boat is aware, intelligent, somewhat wily and worldly wise, Vithobai in the life to come is benign, devoted and steadfast. Both Maurice and Pinmay played pivotal roles in the sexual awakening and the resultant identity crisis of their partners. Forster's depiction of his protagonists and their troubled relationships as they inhabit within the structure of imperialism gives an idea about how such disruptive desires counters the narrative of marginalization while resisting political ideologies of the empire. Thank you.
So we move to questions. What I will do is I will take this microphone. Just kind of move this microphone without turning it on. We do this.
You have to push it forward.
Forward. Because it's very tightly flat. Sorry. I wonder if this one is more. Can you do it, Christoph? You'll have greater strength. Well, there's a knack to it. Thank you very much. So I will move round to ask questions, and then the main thing that we have the main thing you have to do is you have to have the answer of the question in the camera view. So
the camera is 180 degrees. So
right, so it's quite wide space. So yeah, so if we and then people just come into view. So yes, so
maybe I will reveal what's in the views.
Yes.
Howard, I have a question.
Excellent. So, Stuart, if you would start us off and let you have the microphone. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for keeping us timed.
Yes, just to kick off a question for Arpana and Deetimali, please. How do you reconcile Forster's suspension of an ending in A Passage to India, Aziz and Fielding, Not Here, Not Now? The earth, the horses pull their relationship away. How do you reconcile the suspension of an ending in A Passage to India with the fulfillment of the endings in the two short stories that you read, the culmination of passion, violence, ambivalence? How do you reconcile the two different strategies? that Forster used in ending his novel on the one hand versus the two stories you analyzed on the other. Thank you.
Sir, when I think about both the endings, Passage to India and in the short stories, I think that there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of ambivalence, I think in both the texts. But whereas I think Passage to India is a little, how should I say, it's not as violent maybe, whereas in these short stories they are very violent and they are almost grotesque. And I think somewhere in that ending Passage to India, there is a little bit of confusion about how to reconcile these different racial and cultural identities, whereas here it is more complicated because of the sexual identities also involved, and somewhere I feel there is, where he was trying to imagine perhaps a failure to imagine some kind of transcendent identity in these short stories. And in the other short stories also, I think you have Mr. Dr. Wallacott, and in others where these kind of identities are involved. I think possibly he could not see beyond. It was perhaps not possible for him because he would have been given the kind of climate that he lived in those times in England. There was because homosexuality was a criminal offense then, so it would not have been possible for him to, despite his sympathies, I think, to really come out and make a very explicit kind of a statement. That's my perception, sir.
Thank you. So interesting on those connections between issues of anti-colonialism and sexuality. Thank you. So we'll saw David's hand go up, so I will give him a microphone.
Well, thanks to all speakers. It was really great to have a session with focuses on the short stories and on classics. And I mean, I have a load of questions, and I'm going to be very selective because we don't have very much time. But I did enjoy everything. So first, Maxime, kind of just an observation and a question. First of all, so you mentioned the other boat, and the other boat has been coming up a lot today, which is great. There is that reference, isn't there, to, and this is just a comment, a reference to Lionel as half Ganymede, half Goth, which is a kind of extraordinary kind of combination that you could work that interestingly into your discussion, I think. You might want to respond to that. But my other point to you was Perpetua. I mean, a whole tradition develops around Perpetua and Dinocrates. And it doesn't start with Augustine. I mean, it goes back to a text called the Passio Perpetuae, or Passion of Perpetua, which is an account of a martyrdom of a young woman, not a virgin, in fact she's a mother with a baby, in the year 203. It's one of those great moments that we can actually date, where Dinocrates is her brother. And I've got very interested because late antiquity, the period you're talking about, the late empire, is so rare in Forster, which is one of the things that makes the talk such an interesting story, because it's an outlier. Really, I don't really have a question unless you have anything that you could enlighten us on about the Perpetua.
Regarding, well, thank you. Yeah, the half Ganymede, half God. Yes, absolutely, and also so Ganymede recurs and Maurice as well at the end. Regarding Perpetua, I mean, it was an older tradition, but I mean, Forster knew of it thanks to Augustine. The virginity thing is more something that he draws from Saint Jerome, who was obsessed with virginity apparently, and so, on lots of passages in the Commonplace book about the detestable Father Jerome, his obsession with virginity. Also, really Forster hated Jerome. Augustine he disliked because of original sin and all this, but yeah. Well, but thank you very much.
Just one comment on that. I did my PhD on Saint Jerome, so in a different incarnation. So there's much we could talk about, I'm sure.
I'm certainly not a specialist of Saint Jerome, but
yes. Right, I just one thing for Nico. So conscious of time here. Just one small point is that Forster didn't edit the Dent translation of the Aeneid. It was a previously published translation that had been published in 1902 or 1902, I think. So it was republished by the translation by a man called Edward Fairfax Taylor, who had died by the time of that Dent edition. Forster was simply commissioned to write the introduction, which is really quite interesting, I think, and the notes, which are not at all interesting. So that was just a very small point. He didn't edit it. But I might have misheard you, but I think you said something about Rome offering Forster a more democratic model than Greece, and I didn't quite follow that.
Yeah, I'm not happy with that term either. Maybe non-elitist would have been a better, because we think of Athenian democracy, right? But yeah, I think that'd be a better term.
No, thanks for that clarification. I think that's, yeah, I mean, the problem is you've got Rome and British imperialism going hand in hand as well. There does seem to be a move. Hellenism rises in the early 19th century, and then you have Gothicism kind of set against it, of course. The model of Rome, which is so prominent, I think, in, say, the 1830s with Bulwer-Lytton and Macaulay, that becomes more prominent later on, 1870s, 1880s, and I think that kind of feeds into things as well. You know, when Disraeli pronounces Queen Victoria Empress of India in 1876, I mean, I think that's symptomatic of how Rome is becoming a kind of more significant model than Greece had been. Hellenism is preserved in a different sort of way, and I'm going to stop actually, but I might talk to Mykyta later about this, because the notion of Hellenism is also something that needs, I think, more unpacking than it's commonly been given in studies in Lit. Sorry, I really didn't intend to give a lecture.
All right. So I did see someone has a hand up. So meet midway. Early connect.
Right. Thank you so much for the session. I've learned so much.
Switch the mic.
Hello.
You have to push it for like 3 seconds.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for the session. I've learned so much from all of your papers. I have 2 questions, one for Mykyta and one for Maxime. Thank you. Mykyta, I'm very intrigued by your use of the term intermediality. Would you mind to kind of speak a little bit more about it? And Maxime, thank you for the fascinating paper. I've learned a lot. Would it be possible for us to speculate a little bit why Forster kind of wanted to have the short story torn? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead. No, I mean,
well, there's a lot of that in the diary on a regular basis, and there are many contradictory statements. There's a similar one for little Imba some what he says, or he wrote, sorry. Little Linda might see the day of night after my life, or something like this. So, you know, that sort of contradictory statements. He was very ambivalent about them, which is understandable, but from a personal point of view. And I suppose even as a writer, I mean, he was ambivalent about, you know, showing that other aspect even after his death. I mean, because he was concerned about, you know, you know, the image that he would have after his death. You know, he wrote that text, My Own Centenary, and Average Harvest. So I mean, he thought about this. So he was very ambivalent about it, which yeah, that's the best I can do with it.
Just thank you for the question, very quick answer. I try to use intermediality in the most broadest sense possible, and I think you need first to think about intertextuality, and when they claim that everything is text, so the next step was to claim that everything is media, and then in this case intermediality is the study of medial relationship between different artifacts. I try to look into literature specifically, and then it's a question of change of mode, of style, of form, visual form of the text. Sometimes, I mean, the classic examples are actually actresses and musicalization of fiction and all those things, but there is much more to that, many more other things.
Well, thank you so much. I think lunch is calling, but before then we really do want to thank our speakers for an excellent session.